Okay, well, hello everyone. Good morning for those of you here in the United States, and good afternoon to everybody who's joined us from the UK. We've got a big crowd today, so I'm just going to chat a little bit while people join from the waiting room. And let me say a huge welcome to everybody to this British American Business CEO discussion with our guest today, Scott Kirby, who of course is the CEO of United Airlines. And Scott, great to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Duncan. Glad to be here.
So just for anybody who is new to British American Business, just a word about us. We are the leading transatlantic trade organization. We are in fact the American Chamber of Commerce in the UK and the British Chamber of Commerce here in the US. And we represent the interests of around 400 companies that do business in and between the US and the UK, including United. And we focus on policy issues, anything that helps to make trade and investment easier between the US and the UK. And we also focus on this kind of thing, on convening our members to hear from interesting people on the topics of the day. And so that's what we're going to do today. Just a word about the format of today's event. As you can see, this is a meeting format. It's not a webinar, it's a meeting. So everybody, in theory, if you keep your camera on, is visible, and everybody can participate in this discussion. I'm gonna have a chat with Scott for 40 minutes or so, and then hopefully we'll hear from some of you. And if you have a question, please let us know. And you can do that by using the chat function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. You can let me know or one of my team know that you'd like to ask a question, or you can just ask it in the chat, and I will, or make a comment, and I will try to weave that into the discussion as we go along. So I think everyone's a Zoom guru these days, so everybody knows the rules of the road. So it's a thrill to welcome Scott to join us today. It must have, if you think about it, there aren't many businesses that have had more challenging years than the airline business over the last 12 months. So it's really a privilege to have Scott join us today. He was appointed CEO of United in December 2019, and that job became effective in May 2020. So his timing was perfect.
Right in the fire.
Oh my God. Before that, he was the president at United and for 4 years, and before that, he had a long and distinguished career in and around the airline business. So who better to talk to us today about what's going on in that sector and what the future looks like. So Scott, welcome again. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Duncan. Looking forward to it.
So what I'd like to do to start with, if I may, is just ask you to give a bit more color about your own background and your journey in the airline business to the position of CEO. I think it's always interesting for people to get the context, and maybe tell us a few of the kind of interesting kind of waymarks along that journey.
Sure. Well, I started actually when I was in 8th or 9th grade, decided that I wanted to be a pilot, a fighter pilot, and then an astronaut. I was a history buff. I'd read every single book on World War II in my local library by the time I was a freshman in high school, and that was air power. So I went to the Air Force Academy. While at the Air Force Academy, you do basic flight training, and realized that I was at best an average pilot, and I was not going to be a fighter pilot, and I was not going to be an astronaut. So I was, I think, the only person in my graduating class who was PQ, physically qualified, that chose not to go to pilot training. And instead, I had just a phenomenal job working at the Pentagon in economic analysis and resource planning, where I just got to work with brilliant people, PhDs in economics. I was 21 years old, and it was a great start. And from there, I got back into aviation really by accident. I wanted to do something with math, which was my graduate degree, and went to American Airlines, and then I've just done one thing after another. I've always tried to pursue things that are fun. I feel like I've never in my life had a job. I've always enjoyed what I did and been passionate about it, and kind of 24 hours a day and think about it and dream about it. So I've been fortunate in that regard, but I love aviation. and it is it's a tough business at times, but it really is about connecting people and uniting the world. And I'm sure we'll talk about more of this.
Yeah, we
today.
will. We will.
But
Well,
there's
that's
so
it.
much that we get to do, that really creates a better globe and a better society. And I'm proud of it, but it's also fun.
Well, I mean, for anyone who has both personal enjoyment out of their career as well as the sort of career success, they are very lucky people. So that's great to hear. So we're going to talk a little bit about the crisis, but and how United dealt with that, and talk through all the issues that you've faced over the last year. But before we do that, can you bring us up to date and tell us, how do things stand today? What sort of percentage of your normal traffic are you operating domestically and internationally? How do things stand?
Yeah, well, what a difference a year makes. A year ago at this time, we were burning almost $100 million per day. For a little while, it was over 100 million per day. And we now have our, what we call core cash burn, essentially our cash flow from operations, back to above break even. So, at a high level financially, remarkable progress. I would split our business into kind of three roughly equal tranches: domestic business demand, domestic leisure demand, and long haul international travel. Domestic leisure is over 100%. Like I was joking before, I don't know how anyone can find a hotel room in Florida. As many people are flying to Florida these days. It really is over-indexing at 100%, which is really good news, because it shows huge pent-up demand to travel, to reconnect with family, with friends, to go on vacations, all the things we couldn't do for the past year. Domestic business demand, the second third, is still down about 80%, because most of us are still, I'm here at my home in Dallas. I wasn't the headquarters in Chicago yesterday, but office towers in the big cities are largely still closed. And until people are back in offices, I don't think business travel is coming back. I happen to think that the inflection point for that is going to be in the fall, when schools are going to mostly be back in session. I know we're going to be back in the office. Lots of people are going to start to be back in the office, and that'll hit the inflection point where I think that business demand will come back. And you can put me firmly in the camp of, business demand is not about transactions, it's about relationships. And you can't build relationships like this the same way that you can in person. And that business demand, it won't come back immediately, but will come back. And then the third one, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, is long haul international. And again, long haul international is essentially shut down when the borders are closed and you have to have quarantine requirements. I'm anxious to get those open. I have my fingers crossed that the UK may actually be the first with the US to figure out a way to have. And the truth is, we have similar vaccination status. We have similar case counts, and figuring out a way to open that corridor. If we can get that one open, it can be a template for the rest of the world, whether we require a vaccine certificate or just open it. And I know we'll talk about this.
Yeah, we're going to dig into it. We're
anxious to have that open. And then that'll be the trigger, I think, that others would follow, and that can start opening up the rest of the world.
But it's a positive story, isn't it, when you think about it? I think if 6 or 8 months ago, we had predicted that the leisure travel market was as buoyant now as it is, I think people would have struggled to believe that. I mean, so there's inherently there's confidence amongst passengers about getting onto the planes.
Yeah. Well, we, at United, we decided at this time last year, really back in April, that our view was that leisure demand would come back, business demand was going to come back at 100%, and long haul international would ultimately come back at 100%. We were in the distinct tiny minority. We were the only ones that thought that. By the way, we built our fleet plan around that. We're the only big airline that didn't shrink. And today, United Airlines has almost as many long haul international wide body aircraft as American and Delta combined as a result of that decision. So we've expected this to be the path, but it's really, especially for me, great to see confirmation that our expectation is coming about, and that once people are able to get back, there's a huge desire to get back to seeing people. And we did Zoom calls with my family, to talk about business. We were doing these with my family, but we've in the last 2 weeks, had the whole family getting together here with us in Dallas, and it's just incredible. People I hadn't seen that I love that I haven't seen for a year to get back together.
Yeah, there's nothing like it. Okay, so that's helpful to know where we stand today, and we'll dig into the future a bit in a minute about how we get the rest of the market back open, particularly international travel. But perhaps you can take us back, if I may, to kind of what was happening a year ago. And I'd just like to get a sense from you about when you first realized at United that we were in for this enormous crisis. I was thinking about it before, and I realized because you have a big market into China and East Asia. I used to use those flights a lot when I had a real job. And so did you hear very early? Did you get a sense very early that this crisis was coming and the scale of it? Just talk us through a little bit about how that happened.
So United was unique at recognizing earlier than others the potential severity of the crisis. And I told you earlier, I read 3 hours a day on average and a book a week. And over the Christmas holidays in 2019, there was a new book that had just been published about the history of pandemics and how pandemics had shaped society going back in millennia. And I just read that. And of course, was reading about this virus in Wuhan. I admit at the time, I thought it was going to be like SARS or MERS. I was paying attention, worried about it. In January, I actually went to China, had a conversation with my wife about whether I should go or not in January, but it was still mostly contained, and you didn't have a lot of good facts. When we realized it was going to be a pandemic was the last weekend of February. When I can remember, we had a board meeting in Los Angeles where we talked about the virus, and we actually put a plan in place. The board approved a plan for 2020 and said, this is really having an impact on China, but right now it's just China. And then that weekend came home and read the news about Italy. And I started calling our executive team. We had a call, I think, on that Sunday to say, the genie is out of the bottle. People don't realize it yet, but this is a global pandemic and we're going to start. And a week later, we had done a $2 billion bridge financing. We'd started approaches to cutting the schedule and cutting costs. We'd started talking to our pilots union, and we first started having these conversations. We had a leadership conference in Chicago, and instead of being at the leadership conference, I was sitting in a back room, and it was kind of like the war room. And one group after another was coming through. What are we going to do for a pandemic? And no one else was talking about it. And I can remember first people were like, "What are you talking about?" Then kind of shock, and then, "Oh my God, if this is right, what are we going to do?" But because we had started early, it put us in a position to just be much better prepared as we went through and be much more realistic.
I'm curious because I mean, airlines have like all businesses, but particularly kind of airlines have very clearly structured disaster recovery plans and crisis management plans. So I'm curious whether any of your DR plans got even close to estimating the scale of this kind of 90% or 90+% collapse in passenger numbers and so on. Did you get anywhere near that in any of your DR plans?
We did not. And my whole career, I have not allowed people to put forward things that say worst case scenario. You can call it a bad scenario, because there's always something worse. And sadly, that turned out to be prophetic. From a financial perspective, the modeling that we'd done was 9/11, the by far worst thing that ever happened financially to the airline industry. But in 9/11, our revenue was down 40% in the first 2 months after 9/11, and then gradually came back. And by the time we were a year away, it was down 5%. We're 13 months into this, and our revenues are down 60% still. So this is like an order of magnitude worse than 9/11. Our disaster planning, like for pandemics, we would take the worst case, SARS or MERS, and use those as the planning scenario. And this has just been an order of magnitude worse than anything that we'd ever planned for. The key, though, is to be flexible. When you're locked into plan, and to turn on a dime. I mean, we turned on a dime on that Sunday, the last weekend of February, to here was our plan before, and the world has changed, and throw everything out and realize that the world has changed, and we just got to accept it and move on.
So if I just pry a little bit into that process, how did you make those decisions? Is this a small central team at United that was working kind of 24/7? when you're being bombarded by kind of external news and so on. How did you manage that? And then how did you communicate your decisions out to the business?
Well, look, part of it, I don't mean this to sound egotistical. Part of it is because I read so much, and because I was at the early part, I was the one saying, this is what I think is going to happen, or is likely to happen. And I know that nobody else thinks this, but this is what I think, and we're going to plan for it. We started a daily in early March. We started a daily, became a Zoom event with the whole executive team. So, and plus a few others. So there's about 12 of us on that call, 7 days a week for a couple of hours, going through everything that we needed to talk about and work on. And I think one of the things that for the team really changed it as we got into the middle of March, and the NBA shut down and the world started to shut down, because we had been talking about this just a week or two earlier, but a week or two earlier when no one else is. It created a confidence in the team that we can see the future better than others, and we're not certain about it, but we have a path. But we spent hours together, and the team bonded. And what we focused on too is have a discussion. And anytime there's a decision to be made, make a decision at the end of the meeting. Don't go back for PowerPoint presentations, more data. We have incredible uncertainty here. And there's not going to be a perfect answer or a right or wrong answer, but make a decision at the end of the meeting. And then when we realize, if we realize it's wrong too, reverse course and change your mind. Don't get locked into any particular path. And that approach of having all of us together, having conversation, it started actually, there were a bunch of times on tough decisions that I would go around the room, the video screen, and ask each and every person, here's a tough decision. It's a 50-50 call. What would you do? And listen to all that. And I found my mind being changed often. Here's what I think. And I would listen to people say, here's what we should do. And sometimes I would go from one to the other, but that's because there were these 50-50 decisions. But we would make a decision at the end. And then if it turned out to be wrong, we'd reverse it later. But going fast and forcing that process and having lots of conversation was critical to getting through in a world that was just massive uncertainty.
Do you think some of that sort of behavior and the things that you learned in terms of communication and how your team work together will be things that you'll carry on in the future, is in using that kind of those techniques?
Oh, absolutely. And we're doing it already. I mean, throughout the crisis, I talked about financials, but all kinds of health and safety initiatives, the Mileage Plus financing program that others copied, but even the stances that we've taken on climate change, or our announcement this week, which is controversial, on diversity efforts. Those are the kinds of things that there's all these hurdles, and corporations are designed to not take risks. They're designed to identify, here's all the things that could go wrong, and let's just not rock the boat and not change the status quo. And we're a whole lot more comfortable at United Airlines doing things that rock the boat, that disturb the status quo, doing the right thing, because of the way we have gone through what we learned in the crisis. And really, I do think it was a culture change, where it's a lot easier for us to make big changes that would have been really hard before.
Well, I know in your end of year report, you said the COVID crisis has changed United forever, and we'll maybe talk a bit more about in what different ways as we go through the next 40 minutes. Clearly, one of the things that you will have had to have done early on, given the scale of the cash burn that you described and the financial crisis, and I guess the same with the other airlines too, is engage with the government on a whole range of issues, I guess. But can you talk a little bit about the relationship with the government particularly on the financing? Certainly when we look around at Europe and the UK, the approach from the US government to the airline industry seems to have been, fast, generous, big, whatever. It's almost like the US government seeing this as a key strategic asset, which probably, people have different points of view and different parts of Europe have obviously acted in different ways and with different airlines, actually, not consistently. So can you give a sense of how you work with the government? And is my characterization right? Is the US government seeing the airlines as a strategic asset?
I think it is right. And I've said it many times, I'll say it again, a huge thank you and kudos for a bipartisan response. And it wasn't just for aviation. The response all the way back in March of last year, the first CARES Act, the second CARES Act, and then sadly the third one was not bipartisan, but was important nonetheless. But it was bipartisan early on. And it also, to me, is a demonstration that the country can find things that we agree on. We're not going to agree on everything, and we can have disagreements. My God, I would like to find things that we could find unity on, instead of just things that divide us as a nation. But the government, House, Senate, administration, I thought did an amazing job of saving the economy from what would have been a depression, but also saving aviation. I'll just tell you, there is some, like, should airlines have gotten as much support as they did or not? What we did, one, allowed us to continue flying in the crisis. And the only people we were carrying at this time last year were 2 or 3 people on a flight flying into New York or New Jersey for medical professionals to come help, or airplanes that couldn't carry customers but were flying to cargo, and our crews were brave, going to a place they thought that was the epicenter at the time, flying in there, loading up with ventilators, medical equipment, PPE, and bringing it back. That's all we were doing. So we were able to do that, but we're also now here to support the recovery. And just, when you rewind, we were burning $100 million a day. I know, because I was the one that was going to make the decision, and we had $6 billion of cash when this started, and no certainty of how long it was going to last. Without government support, we couldn't raise a nickel of private financing in that environment. Without government support, we were simply going to mothball the airline. We were going to stop flying, because we couldn't. Otherwise, we couldn't survive. We were going to mothball the airline and hope we could come back up when this was all over, and that would have taken us years to do. The government support, what it did was gave us a bridge to be able to go out and raise private sector financing as well. And we raised a total of what's going to ultimately be about $30 billion, just under $30 billion that we will have raised to get through the crisis. And look, we're going to spend a decade paying down that debt, but it gave us the bridge to get through and to be here to support the recovery. And we're a multiplier effect around Florida, I'm guessing, is gangbusters right now, the economy, with all the people we're flying there. But it wouldn't have been the case if airlines hadn't had that critical bridge back in March and April to have confidence to keep our infrastructure in place so that we could be here when the recovery began.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of easy to kind of throw criticism at government in the heat of the crisis, and certainly the US government, UK government, other governments, in hindsight, you can say made mistakes. But when you look at the financial response, the monetary response to the crisis last year, the US government, the scale and speed of the Treasury response was extraordinary.
It was amazing. And one of the other things that I should thank, part of the reason we had such a good response for aviation is it wasn't just the companies, our unions carried the water more than we did, frankly.
Right.
And we have things that we disagree with them on, but Sarah Nelson at flight attendants and the AFA and the pilots union and IAM, they were there, and that allowed us to get both sides of the aisle together, and they were a huge contributor to getting this done in the United States. Now, I don't think that partnership happened around the rest of the world. The managements and unions were more at odds with each other.
What's happened then in terms of your headcount? What have you, because that must be one of the most distressing and difficult issues that senior management ever have to deal with, because you're talking about people's livelihoods, people's families and so on. So what point to point, what's the situation in terms of headcount, and what's your expectation in the future about bringing your
well, first, that has been the most difficult thing for me personally as we've gone through this. People often ask, like, what keeps you at night? And I sort of have a standard joke. I literally sleep about 8.5 hours every night. I sleep like a baby.
Me too.
Nothing keeps me up. Good. There's not many of us that do that. It's the best thing you can do for yourself, I think. But I had a week a week of sleepless nights, which for me is just, I don't ever remember having that in my life. And it was as we were leading up to the first CARES Act, but it was because I was thinking about this. If we have to mothball the airline, I'm going to be laying off 100,000 people, and what's going to happen to them? If that happens. And then the second stressful sleepless night was when we got through the first CARES Act, and we actually did temporarily furlough about about 13,000 employees. And I had a sleepless night there. And what I remember about it is I got up and I went for a run the next morning, and a long run. And I came back, and that had caused a kidney stone to break. It turned out I had a kidney stone, and I wound up in incredible pain. And I was on the phone, I think at the time, with Secretary Mnuchin, and I'm on a phone call with him, and I'm just doubled over in my bedroom, like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I have this incredible pain, and then had my wife take me to the hospital afterwards, and it turned out I had kidney stone. I remember our head of government affairs asked me afterwards, what did the secretary say? Like, I don't know. I don't remember anything about the conversation. That's a lot more detail than you wanted. But the good news is, from an employment perspective, we will have fewer less management headcount, but we're going to be back at over 100%. And like, we started rehiring pilots already. I expect that we're going to be hiring, well north of 1,000 pilots a year, and all the other work groups as well. So we're back actually into hiring mode. Once we can see the light at the end of the tunnel.
So that's great. So the consumers seem to be voting with their feet that air travel is safe. But I know that you've done a lot in terms of making sure that the experience from check-in to leaving the plane at the other end is as safe as it's possible to be. Can you just talk through some of the changes that you've made and the things that you've done on the planes to reassure people that flying is safe from a kind of health perspective?
Yeah, being on an airplane really is, and has throughout the pandemic, been one of the safest places that you can be if you're going to be anywhere around other people. And United, we're proud of the leadership role we took. We were the first airline to have a partnership. We called it Clean Plus with Cleveland Clinic and Clorox to help get experts in to advise us. We were the first to require masks on airplanes. I think we were the first or second to start electrostatic spraying, which we still do. We still do every flight. A lot of our competitors don't do that anymore. We're still doing electrostatic spraying on every airplane every day. We partnered with the Department of Defense to do the most comprehensive study of airflow on airplanes that's ever been done, which essentially concluded it's because the airflow is being recirculated every 2 to 3 minutes through HEPA grade filters. The next closest, by the way, is a hospital ICU, which is every 20 to 30 minutes through HEPA grade filters. So it's literally 10 times more air circulation than a hospital ICU. That it's essentially almost impossible to catch an airborne infectious disease on an airplane because of the airflow. And so I think we've led throughout. The other important thing we've done, by the way, which sadly, I think we're the only airline in the world that did this, and we're continuing to do it, is I talked about the airflow and how robust it is, but we've all been on airplanes before takeoff, and you turn on the vent because it's hot and there's no air that comes out. That's because the engines aren't running to power the vents. And the only way to make that really work all the time reliably is to run the auxiliary power units to provide power. And so at United, back in May or June of last year, we started running the auxiliary power. That costs us a couple million a month, by the way. But we started running the APUs before customers get on the airplane and until they deplane, so that you have that benefit of the robust airflow the whole time you're on the airplane. So I've been really proud of what we've done. And a lot of that is going to survive after. The importance of cleanliness and health is going to be a higher priority everywhere in our lives, including on airplanes. And the fact that we've been able to leave is going to help us.
I took a United flight to London in December, and it was fantastic, I have to say. Although your Polaris lounge unfortunately was shut, but it was. I think it's being used for medical reasons. So for medical,
it has been. And we're going to be getting those open. I mean, we're kind of waiting for the borders to open. When you've got a quarantine, there's not much demand. But as soon as the borders open, we're looking forward to getting them back.
So I think I read somewhere that you've been talking, in addition to all of the safety measures and the air and so on and the cleanliness, you've talked about the possibility of mandating vaccination for your employees. Is that right? Did I read that correctly? And where do you stand on that?
You did, and I think vaccines are important. It's safety. It's really a safety issue, and look, in all of aviation, but certainly United, more so than most industries, when we say the word safety, it's like core to our DNA. It is the foundation. It's not lip service. It's real. And so to me, this has always been a safety issue. I also am realistic enough to know that if we're the only large brand that does it, the political pressure, the public pushback would be such that we couldn't sustain that. So we still continue to think about it. What I would say that's been encouraging to me is the level of vaccination. The vaccine hesitancy is less than I feared it would be earlier. As more and more people see their coworkers, and we've done a great job at United of having pods at our hub, in Denver and Chicago. Houston opened up last week, and as they see their and especially being able to do it at work like that, and they see their coworkers getting it, and their friends and their people they know, and they're okay. People that were hesitant become more willing to do it. So I'm not as sure it's going to be as necessary in society, because I think vaccine hesitancy is going down. But it is important that we all get vaccinated. I make that point every time in our break room to ask people. It's harder to say no to the CEO, I guess. Have you been vaccinated yet?
I've had one. Next one next week. So lots of questions in the chat about international travel, as you would expect.
Okay.
And, particularly for us as an organization, the US-UK route is critical. And at the moment, the presidential proclamation is still in place, which basically stops UK's non-US citizens or permanent residents from the UK coming in. And going the other way, there's not a ban, but there is a quarantine requirement, which is effectively a ban. Has the same effect. So, what are you hearing from government, from your trade associations, directly from government? What are you hearing, and what are your expectations about this? I mean, we wrote this week actually to both the President and the Prime Minister of the UK, making the point that while Zoom is great, business needs in-person meetings to really get going again. So it's critical for our organization. What are you hearing, Scott?
Yeah, well, I'll actually start with, I've spent a lot of time talking to the CDC, and as a science nerd before, kind of have thought about this kind of stuff. And the reality is that when we have societies that have similar levels of vaccination, similar levels of case counts, like the UK and the US, we're not increasing the risk any more than somebody going to Florida. Like if I was a government official in China where the case counts are, incredibly low, I would have a different view, by the way, or New Zealand or Australia where it's essentially zero. But it's important, I think, that we start to open those borders up. So we're advocating on both sides of the Atlantic with anyone that will listen to us for that. I also expect that there's a good chance that some form of vaccine passport or vaccine certificate is going to be a requirement in some countries. And at United, we started working on this last summer because we thought this would be a possibility. Actually, we've built something called the Travel Ready Center where you can take pictures of your vaccine documents or your testing documents, and so that we can quickly adjust on the fly as rules might change and might be different from one country to another. But we're focused on trying to find one large country that would open up with the United States, even if it's with a vaccine requirement, which I think is a pretty good chance that's what it be. UK is number one on my list right now because they seem most willing to do it. I think if we could get the UK open, we could prove that it works. And then we could probably open up the rest of the EU. I think Asia is going to be behind across the board. Again, because case counts are so much lower and they're appropriately going to be a little more cautious. But I think getting US to Europe open would be the right thing to do for both of our societies and economies, and we do it safely. And so we're just trying to get, I feel like we've talked to people in governments all around. We've been at the 1 yard line for a long time. And getting it into the end zone is hard. But if we can punch it in with one country, I think that first domino will get the others to start falling.
Well, the UK has announced its traffic light system. Yeah. So countries will be either in red, amber, or green, and I think there's a good chance that the US will be put into green.
I hope so. Fingers crossed. It's important though that there be no quarantine requirement. If you put people, you can do testing. I think we've proven that testing can work. And actually, we've got a test going on right now where you can pick up your test at the airport when you're flying internationally. Yeah. And so even though you have it, everything.
Yeah, I did that. I did that on my way back to the US in December.
Yeah. So I think we can live with that, but we can't. People are not going to travel if they have quarantine requirements.
Do you think the vaccination pass is a better solution than the test? I mean, and is the technology? Do you think the technology is reliable and kind of fraud proof?
I think the vaccine. This is about minimizing risk. This is not a zero risk, but it's about minimizing risk. And I think personally, I think the vaccine is better. I could go through the science and why. I feel safer with that. And the other challenge is on the test is antigen tests. I think are better for safety. They're quicker. And yes, it's true that you can have a false negative, but if you have a false negative, you're at a level of virus load that you're probably not transmissible. And the comparison to PCR tests, which are expensive and which are harder to do and take days, I think we'd be better off. And fortunately, the US government and the CDC allowed antigen testing on international travel. So particularly if we could use antigen testing, it could even be a combination of you've had the vaccine, but you test either before or after you arrive. Before you leave, it'd be better so people have confidence. Take a test. I think that's a pretty good solution to at least start, and then you can gradually open it up more. But the key is antigen testing.
Yeah, and we've got a lot of businesses on this call for whom international travel is important. So, I would advise anybody who thinks this matters to get your own company to write to the administration in both the US and the UK, because they want to hear from businesses, not just from airlines, that this is important, or not just from trade associations. And yeah, as someone, Jeremy Amius from Standard Charters put it in the chat, at the moment, if you're on a visa and you're working here, you can leave, but you can't come back, and that's hopeless. So you need to be able to be allowed back into the US. Anyway, we're going to switch gears now because there's a couple of issues that I wanted to talk to you about that you've kind of been in the news for over the last couple of days.
Kind of.
Yeah. So, firstly, can you just talk through the announcement that you made about the diverse intake that you're planning in your pilot training facility, and just talk through the thinking behind that?
Yeah.
And we were chatting beforehand about your surprise about the reaction as well. And yeah, I have to say I shared that surprise. So can you talk a little bit about your ambition here?
Sure. And I'll make it a little bit broader, which first I'd say, United, I am confident that everyone on this call is going to believe in a couple of years that we are the best airline in the world for what we're doing for customers and to fly on and to travel. But what I've realized as we've gone through the crisis is we have such a high profile and a platform that we can not just be a great airline, we can actually make a difference in the world. And there's two places we've chosen to really double down on that: climate change and diversity. On the diversity front, there's a lot of talk in corporate America, and there is not a lot of action. And so I was really proud to announce this week our United Aviate Academy, which we're going to train over 500 pilots a year. And there's huge barriers to entry to becoming a commercial aviation pilot. You either have to be in the military, or you have to have parents who are wealthy enough to send you to your own, basically spend you $100,000 getting you the hours and getting you the training. And what we're doing is creating an academy where it has all the same rigorous regulatory safety certification standards that any commercial airline pilot has today. But what we're doing is raising our ability to recruit from diverse populations. Fewer than 19% of our pilots, because of those barriers, today fewer than 19% of our pilots are women or people of color. And at the United Aviate Academy, we're going to have over 50%. We're going to partner with women in aviation organizations, historically black colleges and universities. We're going to recruit great people. Now, they're going to have to go through the same rigorous training, safety that anyone has to go to, exactly the same test. They're going to be absolutely as qualified as anyone else. But we're just giving them a chance and get it on. When we talk about equality in this country, to me, equality means equality of opportunity. And the reality is, if my kids could, if they decided they want to be a pilot, I could send them to the training and get it done. If you grew up on the south side of Chicago, you got no chance unless you happen to be fortunate enough to do what I did and go to the Air Force Academy. But otherwise, you basically have no chance to become a commercial airline pilot. We're going to give those people a chance, and I'm proud of it, and it is the right thing to do. We were talking earlier. I've been surprised at the negative reaction to that. This would seem like something to me that everyone could unite around, and I've been surprised at the negative reaction. And look, to be honest with you, what I think it is, I was naive, and I kind of thought racism in our country was really subtle and subconscious for people. That's wrong. There's some people that are overtly racist, and my email inbox can prove that to you. And what it means is that this is even more important than I thought it was before, because I thought this was important before. But given that reaction to it, the negative side of the reaction to it, it's even more important that corporations stand up and lead and change society, because we have further to go than I fully appreciated before we launched this. But I'm really proud of it. I got asked on a different call, somebody that said, what do you hope when you retire someday that they talk about you? And I think we'll be the biggest and we'll be the best airline and all that kind of stuff in the world. But the two things that I want, people to remember me for is actually making a difference on climate change and making a real difference on diversity efforts.
Yeah, and yes, what's interesting, the study, the academic work in this area has also advanced a lot over the last few years. And historically, it was always seen as, well, it's the right thing to do. But the evidence now is very clear that it's also good business. That the more diverse an organization is, the more diverse the inputs into decision making are, the better the outcomes, including financially, including economically. Yeah. And in the end, it's all about the pipeline, isn't it? It's you've got to start with intake. And so
this is about, to me, and by the way, doing the right thing is enough to me. You don't need to.
I understand that.
But to me, is giving people a chance to get on the first rung of the ladder. It's up to them to climb the ladder. They got to do everything after that. They got to work hard. They got to be good. They got to do everything they need to do to climb the ladder, pass their tests, pass their certifications. But giving them a shot to get on the first rung of the ladder is something at United we're going to do, and I'm proud of it.
Fantastic. And then the other thing you've talked about is sustainability and climate change. And you issued a statement in December, quite an ambitious statement, talking about reducing greenhouse emissions to zero by 2050. And I'm not an expert in this area, but from what I understand, this is different. This is materially different to the kind of offsetting idea of planting trees and so on. This is about actually, which kind of doesn't really do it, actually, if we're honest, does it? I mean, offsetting doesn't really do it. But so this is about capturing the carbon. Can you explain what you're planning to do?
I will. First, I'd say this is something I've cared about and been passionate about since the 80s. Again, I'm a science nerd, and it was clear back then that climate change was likely happening, and that we needed to do something about it. Fortunately, there's not many people, not serious people, that deny climate change now. But we haven't done enough, as I said. People don't understand what we need to do to solve the problem. I just yesterday finished reading Bill Gates' new book, and he says a lot of the same things you're going to hear me say today. So I loved it. A little bit of confirmation bias, but I would encourage everyone to read it. It's a big problem. It's hard to solve. There's not easy answers in a lot of these places, and aviation is one of them.
Aviation and cement.
Aviation, cement, steel. There's all kinds of things that it's easy to say, oh, just X, Y, Z, that aren't going to really solve it. But we really want to solve it at United. And so we have three big pillars. One is sustainable aviation fuels, and we represent over 50% of the world's commitment to sustainable aviation fuels. I think we're the only one that I know of, airline, that has invested in companies. We're in the R&D stage right now to commercialize, drive down the economies of scale. It's a lot more expensive today. We've got another big announcement coming next week on sustainability, but driving more innovation in sustainable aviation fuels is important. And by the way, it's important when we do that to not take arable land out of production. We shouldn't be, turning a cornfield in Iowa into jet fuel instead of using it in the food chain. And so finding places that you can have feedstock that are not interrupting the food chain are important. Second one is carbon sequestration. The math simply doesn't work on climate change if we don't take air out of the atmosphere and bury it underground. And this is, at United, we made 100% green commitment. You said it's different. It's different because we said we will get there without using carbon offsets. Today, essentially every company that says they're going to get to net zero is doing it by purchasing carbon offsets. There's some great articles, if anybody wants to, I'll forward them to you, about carbon offsets and the problems with them. The problem is you've got these conservancy funds and things that they're their own judge and jury. They tell you as a company, we're going to give you a carbon offset, but they decide what counts. There's no auditing, there's nothing.
The truth is the public isn't buying it either. You get these stories, particularly in the aggressive kind of British press, of celebrities flying private particularly, and then say, on a G5, and then saying, well, we've offset our carbon, it cost us $100 to offset our carbon. And it's ridiculous. People don't buy it at all.
And the bigger point is, even if the carbon offsets were real, which a lot of them are not, but even if they are, they're basically planting trees. Carbon offsets are basically planting trees. Yeah. And mankind emits 4,000 times as many emissions today as we did in the pre-industrial era. You cannot plant 4,000 times as many trees. There's no room on the planet to do it. You just can't do it. And so we have to have carbon sequestration. And then our third pillar is technology. We launched our partnership with Archer Aviation, eVTOL aircraft. They're never going to replace airplanes flying from New York to London. Energy density is simply nowhere close to big enough to do it. But they, have potential in short haul and small kind of market service. And just investing in the innovation is important because you'll get spin-off technologies and R&D. And so those are the three big pillars.
Yeah. Do you think there's any scope, with the kind of engine makers and so on, that they're, I know people have said that electric engines are impossible. They are impossible at the moment, but do you think there's any scope for some sort of breakthrough? Someone's asked about in the chat as well about a return of supersonic flight. I'd be interested in your opinion about that too.
So first on battery power, they're not in our lifetimes are they going to power long haul airplanes with a lot of people. It's simply because the energy density of jet fuel is 35 times higher than a battery. So you have to have 35 times as much weight of batteries to get the same amount of power. The airplane can't take off. And hydrogen, by the way, is better than jet fuel. Even if you assume you produce green hydrogen. Hydrogen, though, is 1/3 the energy density. Again, and there's nothing even on the theoretical drawing board that changes that equation. So aircraft are going to be powered with some kind of jet fuel. The place you can replace it, though, is sustainable aviation fuel. You can, instead of having oil come out of the ground and turn into fuel, you can turn, we use, one of our project partners is using municipal solid waste and extracting carbon from that and turning it into jet fuel. Another one is using cooking oil. So there's places like that that we can invest in. But and then on supersonic, the challenges with supersonic are cost, environmental, and sonic boom. So sonic boom, there's not a solution yet. The military apparently is working on some things, but that means you can fly from San Francisco to the Pacific or from New York to Europe, but you're not going to be able to fly over land mass anytime in the foreseeable future. Costs are going to be really expensive, but perhaps there's enough demand for high end that would work. The technology is much better today, and so there are some companies that I'm interested in. I think it is a possibility. And then the final one is environmental. And I think anything to actually get off the ground and be successful, they're going to have to build engines that can run on 100% sustainable aviation fuel. I can assure you at United Airlines, if we ever do something with someone for a supersonic aircraft, it's going to have to run on sustainable aviation fuel because otherwise the carbon per customer is just outrageous.
Well, I know you've got this target date of 2050, so I'll be 86 then. So I'm hoping to make it, and
we'll celebrate together when we get there.
Someone in the chat earlier asked about kind of the broader flying experience, and particularly the airport, the pre-flight experience, check-in security and so on, and the changes that happened because of 9/11, I guess, and other security risks. And I think that question is really about, do you see those being kind of permanent? Is that just a fact of life? And the 2-hour kind of pre-arrival and so on. And then I guess I would join that with the question that we were chatting about earlier about Teterboro here and the competition for particularly first class, business class from the private flying market. And I guess probably the biggest reason why people I know talk about flying private is because of that time gained from the before the flight. How do you compete at the business end of the market? How do you compete with that?
So first, on the airport experience, we are trying to figure out how to, working with the government, we have to do it with the government on how to improve and make that experience better. I would say that, if you're a pre-check customer or if you're in clear, getting through security is pretty easy. It's pretty rare. I don't get special treatment. I go through the lines like everyone else.
No, I mean, I go to Newark and it's fine. I mean,
but the experience for people that aren't pre-checked or clear is harder. And Newark's a tough place. I mean, lobby space and things.
Yeah.
And so we are working with the flip side of that too is like for international arrivals, some of the most frustrating experiences can be getting through Customs and Border Patrol when you come in for customers. So the other side of the equation that we're trying to work with governments to improve. In regards to private travel and travel aviation, I don't think it's going to have a huge impact on our business. I mean, just the volume,
right.
We were carrying close to 600,000 people a day. The number, if a handful migrate to private, we're not going to notice it. But I do think one of the things we need to change, and I hope that we will be lobbying to do this, and people who fly private are going to hate it, but is we need to treat private aviation, it should not be treated better than commercial aviation. And today it's better. If there's a ground delay program, if there's weather at Newark, because we have to, commercial airlines fire schedule in advance. The way it works, the FAA says 60-minute ground delay program. You have to delay every flight by 60 minutes. Our flights are delayed. But if I'm flying on a private jet into Teterboro and I wanted to land at 5 o'clock and I filed a flight plan to land at 5 o'clock, I'm allowed, commercial can't do this, but a private jet can simply refile and say, I want to land at 4 o'clock. They get a 60-minute delay. They land at 5 o'clock. I mean, it is beyond ridiculous that we allow private jets to get preferential treatment to commercial airplanes. So I'll get off my soapbox on that. It's infuriating.
No, I can imagine it does. I can imagine it does, particularly when you've got private airfields that are close to big commercial, airports. Yeah. I mean, if it's in the middle of nowhere, then I guess
it doesn't matter. But like Teterboro. The capacity, the number of airplanes that can land at Teterboro or at Newark every day in the summer are reduced because of Teterboro. We had a day a few years ago where I think we had like a dozen international airplanes that wind up having to divert and land somewhere, bringing people back from Europe, essentially because of Teterboro, and increased demand for private jets at Teterboro.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
So I just want to finish, Scott, if I may, on a kind of more general question. As CEO of a major company, and it's the issue that CEOs and companies are kind of, and you've experienced this in the last couple of days, are being drawn into kind of political issues and being asked to make comments or have opinions on political issues. And I just want to get a sense from you, how do you make the judgment? I mean, I don't want to ask about the particular political issues unless you want to talk about them, and the diversity issue or the Georgia voting issue. But I'm more interested in how do you decide what to talk about and how do you decide what not to talk about? And is that you, or is it a team that advises you? I mean, how do you, and just give us a sense of your process.
So I'll tell you my view on it, which is, CEOs in the United States get paid a lot of money. And I think along with that comes responsibility. And sometimes that means standing for something that gets you in trouble. I also think it's important, though, that you really believe it. So the standard for me making comments on things is that I personally feel it and believe it. And so, climate change, diversity, you can probably tell my passion about those things. I understand them. I've been thinking about them. I'm passionate, and I can get on and talk to anyone about them with mind-numbing detail that people don't want to hear because I'm passionate about them. I have a harder time with things if I don't know anything about it. And so, for example, the voting rights registration laws, like, there was people asking me last Friday, we should put out a statement on Friday. I'm like, well, I don't know anything about it. Like, I haven't read the Georgia voting rights law. I don't know anything. And our poor team, I made them spend the whole weekend, ruined everyone's weekend. Like, I'm not going to put out a statement about something I don't understand. And by the way, you'd see our statement on that. All we said was that we support access to voting. It's ridiculous to restrict access to voting. That doesn't mean every provision in the law is bad. There's certainly some that are bad, but doesn't mean every single one of them.
Right.
And so I think it's incumbent on us as CEOs to find the things that we can be passionate about, but we should also understand them. Like, you'll never see something written from United Airlines on a subject like this that was written as just talking points from our team. Actually, they all joke about it. Like, they don't give me talking points because to me, like, talking points, like, if I don't understand it, I don't want to talk about it. If I need talking points, I shouldn't be talking about it. But we should all take the time to educate ourselves. We're not going to be able to be perfect on every issue, and certainly every local issue. Like, there's just not enough hours in the day. Apparently, there's 47 states that have voting rights registrations laws right now. I don't have enough hours in the day that I can understand all 47 of them. I just don't.
Well, it was interesting also because Mitch McConnell yesterday said, business should butt out of politics, and he's kind of walked that back, of course, because businesses have both talked about political issues for 100 years. I mean, and have been involved in it, and by the way, I do wish we as a society could find more things that we can unite on instead of just divide and run to our corners. And by the way, on climate change, I told you this earlier, Duncan, but I read an article over the weekend about the Clean Air Act and how phenomenal it's been for saving lives and reducing pollution. But the most amazing thing in the National Geographic article was the Clean Air Act in 1970, this huge seminal piece of legislation that's changed our lives, passed with a unanimous vote in the Senate and only one no vote in the House. And by the way, 1970, not exactly a time of coming together, the Vietnam War, civil rights legislation, but somehow they came together. Like, can we please, as a society, get back to finding some things that we can agree on and finding ways to unite instead of just ripping our society apart? Well, on that very positive note, Scott, I'm going to say on behalf of British American Business and everybody who's been watching today, a huge thank you to you for such a fascinating discussion and for giving us some of your very precious time. But I know it must be a very full day that you still have these days. So appreciate your being with us, and appreciate you and your team's great support for our organization. It really matters to us. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Duncan, and everyone else. And I'll hopefully get over to the UK. Fingers crossed if they open it up, I'm coming this summer. So hopefully see
yes, please. All right, good to see everybody. Thank you, Scott.